September 9th, 1943. As the Allies invade mainland Italy at Salerno, they have an unlikely hero on their side, HMS Nelson. This eccentric, old, accident-prone 1920s British battleship, a floating relic of a short-lived class built 20 years ago, is about to use one of her most unusual features to wreak havoc on the enemy. As thousands of troops leap out of their landing craft and race across the sand, a storm of ammunition rains down on them from the German 16th Panzer Division, which blocks their path. However, thanks to her bizarre design, Nelson has a unique advantage. She has all her guns at her fore. Facing the German defenses head-on, she pounds them with a brutal barrage of 16-inch shells. Unleashing the full force of her 9 thundering cannons, she clears a path for the Allies to push on with their mission to liberate Italy and ultimately win the war. Originally, the unconventional arrangement of HMS Nelson's weaponry had been an innovative response to limitations imposed by the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty, which restricted new battleships' displacement and armament. With work beginning in that same year on the Nelson class, which would consist of just one other vessel, HMS Rodney, Nelson's designers would have to get creative in order to create the most effective battleship possible while respecting the conditions of the treaty. They soon realized that by placing her 3 triple-gun turrets forward, they could give her an armored citadel that was shorter and lighter, allowing them to comply with the defined maximum weight of 35,000 long tons without having to cut back on firepower, while also enabling them to give her thicker armor on the belt, deck, turrets, and conning tower. Traditionalists lambasted this radical move by the Royal Navy at the time for several reasons. Primarily, they were concerned that the ship would be left defenseless if her front part were to be damaged, and that she would be unable to engage enemies at her stern without completely turning around, both major tactical drawbacks. However, the design's defenders pointed out that Nelson could make full use of her guns without having to present her broadside, making her effective in head-on engagements while allowing her to maintain a minimal profile. Just shy of 710 feet long and able to house a crew of up to 1,361, Nelson was launched in September 1925, undergoing nearly 2 years of preliminary sea trials before being commissioned in August 1927, joining the Atlantic Fleet, later the Home Fleet, as its flagship 2 months later. In March 1931, Nelson would experience her first brush with danger off the coast of Cape Gelano, Spain. Struggling to navigate through a blanket of thick fog, her crew suddenly realized she was on a collision course with the steamship SS West Wales. Fortunately, the 2 vessels mostly scraped each other's hulls sideways, only causing light damage that did not require extensive repairs for either ship. 3 years later, she would again find herself in a tight spot, this time due to her design. Nelson's short length relative to her displacement had left her with a higher center of gravity and less lengthwise stability, while the forward placement of her guns also negatively affected her balance, making for poor handling, especially at low speeds. In January 1934, just minutes after leaving Portsmouth for a spring cruise of the West Indies with the Home Fleet, a jarring tremor ran through Nelson's hull. Embarrassingly, she'd run aground on a shallow area just outside the harbor known as Hamilton Shoal. Luckily, however, she managed to get away intact, simply removing certain supplies and equipment to reduce her weight before floating off during the next high tide. With the onset of World War II in September 1939, Nelson would face a different type of hazard in the form of German U-boats, as the North Sea turned into a hotly contested marine battleground. On October 30th, near the Orkney Islands off northeastern Scotland, enemy submarine U-56 was able to sneak up on Nelson, positioning itself at a nail-bitingly close range of 870 yards before letting rip a trio of G7 torpedoes. As they sped toward Nelson's hull, it seemed the game was up for the British battleship. 2 of the 3 torpedoes hit the target, but miraculously, neither of them exploded, probably due to defects with their detonators, and Nelson was once more able to escape unscathed. Yet, with more and more U-boat activity in the area, the waters off Scotland would remain perilous for ships like Nelson. On December 4th, near the entrance of Loch Ewe, she sailed into a trap laid by U-31, hitting a powerful magnetic TMC mine. The massive explosion ripped a 10-foot hole in her hull, injuring 74 crew members and causing substantial flooding. Crippled by the blast, she was taken to Portsmouth for extensive repair work, which would take 8 months. Nelson was finally ready to re-enter the fray in August 1940 and was sent with her sister ship, HMS Rodney, to Rosyth near Edinburgh to protect Scotland's east coast from possible invasion before heading north to defend the waters between the Faroe Islands and Iceland, where the Germans had been attempting to raid Allied merchant shipping. However, with the brand new battleship HMS King George V entering service at the end of the year, the Nelson class was beginning to look somewhat dated. King George V and her classmates had a more modern design. They were faster, more versatile, and better protected against torpedoes and mines, and they also featured state-of-the-art radar and fire control systems, which would give them the upper hand in naval combat. Nevertheless, Nelson's impressive forward firepower ensured she would remain a force to be reckoned with. Though she narrowly missed out on participating in the legendary sinking of the German battleship Bismarck in May 1941, unable to arrive on the scene in time, a few days later, she was sent to intercept the supply ship Constantine. Taking one look at Nelson bearing down on her, Constantine's crew preferred to scuttle their ship rather than face the British cannons. In July of that year, Nelson entered the Mediterranean theater for the first time, where she was tasked with escorting troops and vital supplies to the Allies' key strategic base at Malta as part of Force X and later Force H, becoming the flagship of Force H's commander, Vice Admiral James Somerville, on August 8th. The following month, Nelson would participate in Operation Halberd, a carefully designed plan to penetrate the Axis powers' blockade of Malta, pushing through with the convoy from Gibraltar. As the operation began, Somerville transferred his flag from Nelson to Rodney, sending Nelson and her destroyer escorts west from Gibraltar, away from the Mediterranean, suggesting that Force H was being reduced and that Rodney was relieving Nelson of her duties. However, it was all a cunning ruse. After nightfall, Nelson turned back to join the second convoy to Malta instead. Under cover of darkness, the British ships swiftly cut through the calm Mediterranean waters, determined to reach their destination. Yet, as dawn rose over the horizon, they were spotted by aircraft from the Italian Regia Aeronautica. Soon enough, all hell broke loose. The Italians launched into a fierce attack, met with heavy anti-aircraft fire, as well as aerial defense from the convoy squadron of Ferry Fulmer fighters. Amid the chaos of battle, a group of 3 Savoia Marchetti SM-84 torpedo bombers managed to break through the British screen, Nelson firmly in their sights. As the bombers let loose their torpedoes, Nelson desperately attempted to comb their tracks, yet inadvertently sailed straight into the path of an incoming torpedo at a range of 450 yards. The port side of her forecastle took the brunt of the blow, a 30 by 15-foot hole left gaping in the bow, effectively destroying her torpedo compartment and causing extensive flooding. They're rocked by the hit and forced to move at around 12 knots per hour to reduce the pressure on her bulkheads. Nelson pushed on, refusing to let the Italians realize she had been damaged. As the British forces saw off their Italian attackers, the convoy successfully made it through to Malta, allowing Nelson to return to Gibraltar to patch up her wounds before undergoing more extensive repair work at Rosyth. By May 1942, she was back in action, and after escorting a convoy along the west coast of Africa, she soon found herself back in the Mediterranean to take part in Operation Pedestal, another mission to resupply Malta, as the flagship of Vice Admiral Edward Seifert, the operations commander. While Pedestal proved less successful than Halberd, with major Allied losses caused by the Axis powers' deployment of bombers, German E-boats, Italian MAS and MS boats, minefields, and submarine ambushes, this time, Nelson herself managed to survive without a scratch. However, the situation in the Mediterranean was about to get interesting. By 1943, Italy's forces had been seriously weakened, and support for Benito Mussolini's regime was rapidly waning. The Allies were keen to capitalize on this, invading Sicily in June of that year, while Nelson formed part of the covering naval force, patrolling the Ionian Sea to prevent any interference from the Italian Regia Marina. As the ship's cover helped the Allies steadily advance across the island, Mussolini was ousted from power on July 25th, replaced by Marshal Pietro Badoglio, who had previously been the chief of the Italian Armed Forces General Staff. Seeing that the Italian population was tired of fighting what they saw as Mussolini's war and realizing the Axis powers were unlikely to win, Badoglio let the Allies know of his intention to abandon Hitler and join them instead. As the Italian mainland was still crawling with German troops, the Allies planned their invasion, and Nelson was ready to play her part. On August 31st, as General Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army prepared to cross over from Sicily to Reggio Calabria on the toe of Italy's boot, Nelson and Rodney showed off the might of their 16-inch cannons, bombarding coastal artillery positions in the area to make way for the amphibious landings, which would take place on September 3rd. With one point of entry secured, the two sisters headed up the coast to Salerno, where the main invasion was due to take place. In the early hours of September 9th, the pair once again provided a robust shield of ammunition, to minimize the threat posed by the 16th Panzer Division standing in the Allies' way. Less than 3 weeks later, Nelson would be given the honor of providing the venue for the formal ratification of the armistice between Italy and the Allied powers, signed by Marshal Badoglio and General Dwight D. Eisenhower on September 29th. In June 1944, Nelson would once again provide support for an Allied amphibious operation, forming part of the largest seaborne invasion in history, the D-Day landings on the beaches of Normandy. Arriving off of Gold Beach on June 11th, she pummeled German defenses with over 1,000 shells from her 16-inch cannons, taking advantage of their range of over 20 miles to even disrupt targets further inland, taking out bunkers, artillery positions, and other strategic points, while the Allied infantry stormed the coastline. Having completed her role in the invasion, she headed back to Portsmouth on June 18th. However, Nelson's reputation for getting into scrapes would come back to haunt her again. On the way home, she detonated not just one, but 2 German mines. While the first exploded around 50 yards to starboard, the second went off below her forward hull, seriously damaging her. Yet Nelson was born to be a survivor. Despite major flooding, she made it back to port for initial repairs, before being sent to the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard for more extensive work. With the war in Europe reaching its conclusion in May 1945, Nelson would head for Asia, where the Allies were still locked in a fierce struggle with Japan. Joining Britain's Eastern Fleet on July 9th, she was chosen by Vice Admiral H.T.C. Walker as his flagship, from which he would command Operation Liberate, involving a series of naval airstrikes on Japanese positions in northern Malaya and southern Thailand, as well as cover for minesweeping operations in the Strait of Malacca. Less than a month later, the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would effectively end the war. As Japan finally conceded defeat on September 2nd, Nelson would provide the venue for the surrender of those Japanese forces who'd been fighting in the area of Georgetown, Penang. 10 days later, she would also be present for the formal surrender of all Japanese forces in Southeast Asia in Singapore. In the months following the war, after a brief stint as the flagship of the home fleet, Nelson became a training ship. In 1947, however, she was placed in reserve before eventually being listed for disposal the following year. Nonetheless, before being scrapped, she would have one more duty to perform, serving as a target ship. Throughout the summer of 1948, she provided the testing ground for a series of 2,000-pound armor-piercing aerial bombs in order to evaluate their effectiveness. With this final mission complete, HMS Nelson arrived at Inverkeithing, Scotland on March 15, 1949, to begin her demolition process. This marked the end of an impressive career, which, in spite of her unusual design and various incidents that could have permanently put her out of action, had seen her serve as a flagship in various fleets around the globe and participate in some of World War II's most important events.